Open the meeting and
work out what's the viable.
I'll take apologies first. Have apologies from the Deputy Mayor on council business. And
Okay, mate. Thanks very much.
also Councillor Ranai and Councillor Webster-Tarbell, as you can see it there on the board.
Oh, and Councillor Quirks for lateness.
Any other apologies?
Councillor Quirks for lateness, he's on his
Councillor
way.
Quirks for lateness. And I'll move those. Second, please. Thank you, Councillor Brewer. And all those in favour say aye. Contrary carried. And any declarations of interest for this meeting, members? None. We'll move on. Petitions, none. Public input. Is there any public input notified? None. Thank you. Local board input. Any local board input at this stage? We've got to do the minutes as well. Did I skip something? Number 3. I'll move confirmation of the minutes from 8 June. Can I have a second, please? Councillor Cooper, thank you. Favour, say aye. Contrary, no. Carried, thank you. And that takes us to our, takes us to our business of the day. And as outlined, and I will hand straight to John Duguid.
Great.
John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we have 5 topics today. 2 were topics that were deferred from the last ADC meeting on the Unitary Plan a couple of weeks ago, and those were the topics of historic or special character and the pre-1944 overlay. So we'll kick off with those 2, and then we'll move into business, then rural, and then we'll close with a discussion on the rezoning principles. So I'll just invite, so for each of these topics, I'll invite I guess our key lead planner, as we call it, or call them, to just join us at the table. So for this one, we've got 2. We've got one of our heritage team leaders, Rebecca Fogel, and also Lisa Mean, who's our lead planner on special or historic characters. So we've been through this topic a number of times with you, both in the drafting of the plan for those who were here at that time, and also in response to the panel's interim guidance and to confirm the council's position at the RPS, Regional Policy Statement, and in the rules. So you'll be, I suspect, pretty familiar with this one, which is great. So really just to recap, in the notified plan that went out for submissions, we had an overlay. It was referred to as the special character overlay, and it managed the identified values of many of Auckland's older residential and business areas. The mapped areas in the overlay were largely rolled over from the operative district plans. For example, large parts of Devonport, Herne Bay, Mount Eden and Ponsonby were just some examples of areas that were rolled over. But we did have an opportunity in drafting the plan to introduce some new special character areas. For example, the Balmoral tram suburb, Kings Road, Princess Avenue, Mount Roskill, and an area in Papatoe as well. So that was a real positive move to actually get those into the plan and out for submissions. The overlay basically controls anyone wanting to do alterations or additions to houses or business premises within the overlay. It controls the demolition of buildings and the removal of buildings, and there are also some controls on the design of new buildings to recognise the character of these areas. The various rolled over areas had different controls in the operative district plans, even within, for example, the Auckland City or the North Shore plan. Each of the suburbs had slightly different controls, so we rolled that over into the plan so to recognise those differences. That was the agreement of the committee at the time. And in terms of public notification, demolition, total or substantial demolition, and in some cases removal of buildings within the overlay, the committee agreed prior to notification that that should be subject to the normal tests under the RMA. So just to recap on that, for notification in the unitary plan, we can either say always notified, never notified, or leave it to an assessment on a case-by-case basis under the RMA, and that was the approach that was in the notified plan. And we also had character descriptions of each of the areas, giving a brief summary of why they're considered to have a special character. So that was the approach in the notified plan. Where did the submitters come from? Well, as with all topics, a range of submissions, some in support, some in opposition, but just to unpack that a little bit more, there are a range of site-specific submissions asking for places to be added to or removed from the special character overlay, and in particular that areas built after 1944, because the vast majority of these areas that were developed before 1944, we did have submissions asking for more recent suburbs to be given character protection through the unitary plan by adding them to this overlay. For example, a submission that related to that was submission from the Ōrākei Local Board that the Tamaki Drive master plan should be reflected in the overlay or somehow included in the overlay, and there were other areas identified too. And we did have some submissions asking for some of the operative district plan rules to be more accurately reflected or included in the unitary plan, and including some recent plan changes in the Isthmus and the North Shore. So that's where the submitters were coming from. Some also sought changes to the activity status for additions, alterations and demolitions. Some wanted things to be more permissive, more permitted activities. Some wanted things to be more restrictive, moving towards non-complying or prohibited for things like demolition. Some want to change to the notification provisions, either to have more resource consent process non-notified, and others seeking that anything happening in these overlay areas should be publicly notified, including potentially alterations, additions and certainly demolition. Some wanted provisions to better reflect or recognise that infrastructure within these areas is just part of supporting housing and development and so on, and therefore should be better reflected and more enabled in the provisions. There were some restrictive controls there that were perhaps unintended, and some submitters sought amendments to add more information to these character statements. So these aren't rules, it's just background context, so we had submissions asking to beef up the character statements. So after reviewing the submissions, we had a position from the council to take into the hearings, and I'll split this into two parts. First of all, the policies and the rules, and then the maps. So in terms of the provisions or the policies and rules, picking up on the council's approach at the regional policy statement hearing, a change in terminology from special character to something a little bit more precise, where we're talking about historic character. These are predominantly historic areas, and that links them back to Section 6 in the RMA, which is issues of national importance, whereas special character sits further down in the RMA. So that signals an elevation in terms of the status and potentially a review of the mapping of these areas, which did occur. We also proposed amendments to strengthen the words of objectives and policies, get more standardisation across some of the different areas, and we did propose amendments to incorporate the plan changes for the Isthmus 163, or parts of those, and 33 in the North Shore, and that included more business character areas for the North Shore. I think at the time the unitary plan was notified that North Shore plan change hadn't reached the point where it could be included. The demolition threshold was changed from a volume-based threshold, I think, of 30%, anything more than 30%, to measuring the amount of the facades that's, or the surface area of the facades, and in particular the front facade that's being altered, and that was all worked through in mediation. Howick, we've had a few discussions at committee on this, and the provisions for Howick were essentially converted into a precinct rather than a historic character overlay. So that changed from special to historic when the heritage team looked at what was present in the Howick Town Centre. Their conclusion was, and also looking at the operative Manukau district plan, that a precinct in the unitary plan was a better tool to recognise Howick. And so the rules are essentially the same as in the operative Manukau plan. It's just a change in terminology from being a historic character area to a precinct for the Howick Town Centre. There were those minor amendments in the second bullet point there, just some clarity around the rules, further minor amendments in terms of the assessment criteria for the general historic character areas and the North Shore area, and more detailed character statements were put forward by council in the hearings. We then received interim guidance in July last year, This was reported through to the committee. As you may recall, the committee wanted to give this guidance before moving into the mapping. And so they were not convinced about the shift from special to historic character. At that point in time, they hadn't heard in detail from our heritage team. They hadn't seen in detail the results of the survey work that was carried out. But at that point in time, they were not convinced in changing from special to historic character. They felt that that was a change that should go through a plan change after the entry plan becomes operative and open it up for submissions and a future hearing. They were supportive generally of the provisions that Council and Housing New Zealand had developed with others in mediation. They thought they were by and large okay, looking pretty good in terms of notification, demolition and things like that. They felt that that was looking in pretty good shape. They wanted more character statements and supported those. They felt that Howick should remain in the special character overlay, and that really relates back to the second bullet point. They just weren't convinced at that point in time that the shift to Section 6 national importance was the right way to go. They didn't support the inclusion of additional character areas in the PORP at this stage at all. So we did have those submitters that wanted new areas, those areas built after 1944, for example. The panel was saying, no, as part of this process, there's just not enough work. There hasn't been enough work done by the submitters, the council or anyone else to really get to the point of introducing new areas. And they felt that the normal test for notification under the Resource Management Act should generally apply. So Council's position in relation to the maps. So we had the hearing on the rules, we had the interim guidance from the panel. Now we looked at the maps. The heritage team had done extensive survey work looking at individual properties and streets and other historical research. And of the 1,700 hectares originally in the overlay, the council's proposal at the hearings on the maps was to reduce that down to 1,400 hectares and change the name to historic character. That's a net reduction of just over 17% of the overlay. And the greatest areas affected by that reduced overlay were the Newmarket business area, so pretty much all of commercial Newmarket, or a large part of it, used to sit in the overlay. And of course, there are many parts of Newmarket that certainly aren't historic anymore, so those areas were removed, but the older parts of Newmarket remained in the overlay. And then we had what was called Isthmus B in the Auckland, former Auckland City area, the suburbs of Remuera to St Heliers. There was a proposed reduction in the extent of the revised overlay there. Isthmus C in Glendowie was also proposed to be removed, and the heritage team had looked quite carefully at the western end of Stanley Point and Devonport and felt that that didn't meet the council's criteria for historic character. Many of the properties proposed to be excluded, and this I think is a key point, that while the overlay was reducing by 17%, and that's what the council took into the hearings, many of the properties within that 17% had no controls on demolition in the operative plans or in the notified plan. They were within a character overlay, but you could demolish as of right within that overlay. I think that's a key point to make. Not every property, but a large proportion of them had no demolition control on them. They just sat in an overlay. The changes to the maps were considered by the council to be a more accurate reflection of the historic character neighbourhoods, suburbs of Auckland. And with the exception of incorporating those business sites in the North Shore from that plan change, no additional sites, streets or areas were proposed to be included in the overlay. The time frame and the analysis required to get something into the entry plan simply didn't allow for that work. The submitters themselves hadn't done sufficient work to really justify recommending to the panel to include additional areas. Obviously, there's a big opportunity for the heritage team and the council to incorporate new historic character areas in the future through plan changes to the unitary plan once it becomes operative. And as always, we have a slide here on the end, just if you want to look into the evidence from council and the submitters in more detail. There are the topic references and the link again to the panel hearings website, and your support staff can hopefully find that information or come to the planning staff for additional support to delve into this topic or any others in more detail.
Thank you, John. You can breathe now. So that's topic 29 and 79, special and historic character. Are there questions on that section, members?